As you move on to the last third of the horse, then you're going to evaluate the horse's hip area. The horse's hip area for some people is the most difficult to evaluate because we don't have a simple ruler that we can lay out on this horse's body to determine whether or not he has adequate length and depth to his hip. But the first thing that we would like to determine is whether or not, for a stock type performance horse, whether or not this horse has a square appearance in his hip. And generally speaking, what I like to do is draw a line right here from the top of this horse's hip bone straight out to his tail head, drop my line straight down, and go across the front of this horse's stifle. Okay? And obviously, when we look at horses, we're never going to see a perfect square filling in all of those. Okay? But this horse here is a fairly good example of a horse that shows some fullness in his hip, and generally speaking, what we would say has some fullness in the lower third of his hip and has adequate length of his hip in comparison to the rest of his body. Okay, and so this horse right here, for our purposes today, we can certainly evaluate his balance and say that he's adequately balanced, and we can have a pretty good idea of how this horse should move out and track when we watch him on the lunge line, and we'll get the ability to see that here in a little bit. Okay, the last thing I'd like to talk about then in terms of balance using this horse as a model is the depth of this heart girth. The length to that horse's elbow. We'd certainly like to see the same or greater length in this horse's heart girth than we would from the point of the elbow to the ground. And in this animal, as we stand back, we can certainly see that he's got an adequate depth of heart in comparison from this point straight to the ground. The other thing that we can certainly look at is we would like to see a difference or a tapering in that horse's underline as you move back. And as you evaluate that horse's depth of heart, you can come back to see in this area that we're still at a ratio of approximately a 2 to a 1. This horse really does show a great depth of heart and has a nice strong tapering underline along with a strong top line. And so he would be considered a good model for us to evaluate in that area. We've got another example here of a horse that we're going to talk a little bit about this horse's balance in comparison to the sorrel gelding that we just looked at. And we just simply like to point out some differences in the horses. And then, like I said, later we're going to talk about how these two horses move in comparison. We'll again start off up here in the front half and evaluate the horse's neck. And certainly from this horse's midpoint of his wither to his poll and the underline of this horse's neck where he ties into the point of his shoulder, he certainly reaches our 2 to 1 ratio in that area. As we move and we talk about his top line, while this horse is a little bit differently shaped than the gelding that we just talked about, he still certainly balances out. And so it's one of those situations where you want to be able to look at different horses and use the same set of tools that you're given, but realize that not every horse is going to fall under the same example. This horse right here, again, if we measure from the midpoint of his wither to the point of his loin and then measure his length of underline, we still certainly see an adequate ratio of 2 to 1 in that capacity. The last thing then that we talk about with this horse is this horse does show us a little bit different makeup and shape to his hip. This horse is a little bit longer across the length of his hip, both to the edge of his stifle where his hip ties into his gaskin and across the top of his croup. Potentially speaking, what's going to end up happening when these horses move and track is that we're going to see a horse here that has a greater ability to drive from his hindquarters and to utilize his hindquarters to a better extent than the sorrel gelding that we saw earlier. And so while this horse has a different appearing hip, and we can say that both horses are certainly adequately balanced, we'll be able to point out some differences in how their balance affects their